very warm welcome to all the speakers who are with us here today, with many different perspectives from around the world. I'm very pleased to welcome you from the Americas, from the Association of Arab Universities, from the Association of universities in Europe, from UNU, UDUAL and AArU, and from the International Association of Universities. I will be very brief in introducing you to the audience, as your CVs and bio notes can be found online. And I think it is very important for us to get into the conversation and hear you speak rather than take too much of the time away to present you. This is a webinar that we're very pleased to actually co-organize, I would say, because all of the people on the screen are also from organizations that are members of the International Association of Universities, and we're very pleased about that. And to organize this session in two different capacities. Actually, first and foremost, as part of the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference to start next week in Barcelona in Spain, and to bring together many international players engaged in rethinking, reimagining higher education for the future. And this will be part of the conversations, the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on higher education. How does it shape the future of higher education? This seminar and webinar today is actually also part of a longer and broader webinar series that the IAU has launched in the midst of the pandemic to actually provide for an open, international, inclusive space for people to exchange on the different forms and shapes of the higher education sector and how it evolves over time. So it was a way to get these dialogues going at a time when it was more difficult to come together. So we're very pleased to be able to continue to use this important space to bring all the voices from the different parts of the world together. So this session will be recorded, or is already recorded, and will be displayed during the UNESCO WHEC next week, but the recording will also be made available on a YouTube channel, and we hope it will trigger further discussion on the different continents, in the different countries, and at different institutions. We all know that the COVID pandemic has been transformative, and also really a transformative moment in history. It has generated many challenges, but it also came with very interesting new opportunities, like this one here today, to work together in a different way, to also rethink what we do and to analyze the processes that we've been developing over time. It actually accelerated the kind of transformations that were nascent in the higher education sector, but the COVID pandemic allowed to go even faster in that respect, and that's what we will hear from the different speakers. It exposed as well the different strengths of the system. It allowed to show that universities didn't stop operating and they didn't stop teaching and researching. It came at a high price for some, but they all continued to operate. But it also showed the weaknesses of the system, the sector itself, but of society at large. So on the one hand, it demonstrated the importance of global cooperation, as we see it also on this screen, of knowledge, of research and science. But on the other hand, it showed the predominance of narrow interests, leading to also closeness, competition, and eventually greater inequality in the world. So that's what we will see here and discuss as well. So the session will investigate higher education in a new reality. It will draw on the results from the second global survey on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. Higher education 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic by the International Association of Universities. There will be a third survey in maybe a year's time or so to then also evaluate the continuous impact of COVID-19 on higher education. And we thought it was an opportune time at this moment of history, of development of higher education, to invite associations from around the world, regional associations, to shed light on the important aspects under consideration here. Governance, teaching and learning, and research. So we will be very pleased to hear first from Trine Jensen, who is the manager Higher Education and Digital Transformation Publication and Events at the International Association of Universities, and one of the main authors of this second global survey on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education, who will present on the broader global scope of these impacts on higher education. And she will focus her presentation on certain aspects of the global survey, and we'll explain that in a minute. And in particular, 3, and each time we'll pose after having developed a presentation on one of these aspects, and then we will give the floor to you from around the world to reflect and react to the presentation, and then highlight how this translates in your different regions and countries. So after Trine Jensen, we will have the participation of Maria Claudia Soler, who's the Senior Analyst Research at the American Council on Education in the United States. We see the participation of Dr. Ezzat Salama from the Arab Association of Universities, where you're the Secretary General. Warm welcome. Gaebel, Director of the Higher Education Policy Unit at the European University Association based in Brussels. Philip Vaugther, who's a consultant at the United Nations University at the Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, UNU-IAS, based in Japan, in Tokyo. Roberto Escalante, who is the Secretary General of the Union of the Universities of Latin America and the Caribbean, UDUAL, but also one of the precious AArU board members and even a member of the executive of the International Association of Universities. And then we welcome Olusola Bandele Oyewole, who's the Secretary General of the Association of African Universities. And we will each time, in that order, I would say, invite you to react to the presentation on the global perspectives on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. So Trine, the floor is yours to also explain a little bit how this webinar will unfold. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilligje, for the introduction. I think that was very clear, and we're very pleased here to welcome you all to this session where we discuss how does the pandemic shape the future of higher education. And as Hilligje was saying, this is a side event of the UNESCO WHEC 2022, so we're very pleased to be able to contribute along with our partners from the different regions of the world. In order to have this conversation, as Hilligje was mentioning, we are going to have a look at some of the results of the second global survey report that we launched in March this year. And I also want to mention that actually building the questionnaire of this survey was with the close collaboration of our colleagues here, because we find it extremely important, of course, when we build these surveys, that we try to incorporate the different comments and pertinent questions that our regional sister organizations see as well from their perspectives. So I think that it's great that we have this opportunity to come together and discuss here. I mean, this survey was launched on the 1st of March, and the data collected was done 1 year into the pandemic. Our way of proceeding was in order to get an institutional perspective. So we were asking institutions to provide at least or just one reply per institution. We had almost 500 replies from some 112 countries and territories, which was enough for us to have, of course, our global analysis, as Hilligje was referring to, as well as regional perspectives from Africa, the Americas, Asia and Pacific, and Europe. And we're pleased here as well to have among us, of course, Professor Salama, who is from the Arab region and who will have a slightly different perspective because he's not necessarily part of any of these four. He's in between, I would say. So it's also very interesting to bring in that perspective. We had already a more comprehensive presentation of this survey in another webinar that we did earlier in March. So if you want to learn more specifically, I invite you to look at that one. Today, what I'm going to do is just pick a few outcomes because we really want to give the floor to our different organizations with us here today in order to hear what are the main impact that they see from their perspectives. So let's go into the data. First of all, just have a look at the regional distribution. And in order to look at our replies that we received in the survey, we compare it to the distribution of higher education institutions in the World Higher Education Database that AArU is maintaining. And we actually see that the correlation is quite good. However, the thing that I want to note as well is that for the region Americas, 92% of the replies are from the Latin America and the Caribbean. That's also why we are very happy to have you with us here, Maria Claudia, today representing the US, because North America is part of the world where we have less data. So that's why you, even not being a regional organization, it's very interesting to get your perspectives on our data as well, to have this dimension included. So our report is built around 4 main sections, one on governance, one on teaching and learning, one on research, and then community and societal engagement. And in this session, we'll be focusing mostly on the 3 first one, mostly because of time. We will not be able to go into details with it all. Just to mention as well, I think that we had maybe in total 75 questions in this survey. So we will just look at some of the aspects, but invite you all to go download the survey to learn more and to dig into the wealth of data that is available there. So in terms of governance, I chose to bring in a little bit of the data that we see on financing. And this is again, just a few aspects of it. Looking at particularly public funding and tuition and academic fees as revenue streams. And what we see at the global level is that 50% of the higher education institutions receiving public funding, and that is 74 from the ones that responded to the survey, they indicate a stable level of income. So that is overall reassuring. We also see that 18% of the institution has seen an increase in public funding, but on the other hand, almost a third of the institutions report a decrease. When we look at the data again by region, then it is slightly different, and we see a diversity, I would say, in the way that it translates around the different regions. And it is less stable, I would say, in Africa and in Americas, where this only concerns 43% in Africa and 34% in the Americas. And in these regions, it's actually the majority of the institutions that report a decrease in public funding. Europe, on the other hand, it's the other way around. There we see 60% of the institutions reporting stable income in terms of public funding, and even 23% reporting an increase in public funding. In terms of tuition fees, again, we see around half of the institutions reporting a stable level of income. But here, on the other hand, we have almost 40% of the institution reporting a decrease in funding. And then again, we see the same trends by region, less stability in Africa and the Americas, and then a bit more stable environment in Europe, but still in terms of tuition and academic fees, we also see a third of the institutions in Europe reporting a decrease. However, the way that we measured this was only in terms of seeing the trends. We were not able to measure the proportions among public funding and tuition fees within the different institutions, but it gives us general ideas in terms of the financial situation 1 year into the pandemic. So that's one aspect that I wanted to put on the table here for conversation. Linked to that as well, I wanted to bring in a slide on student enrollment. I think that's important for all institutions around the world as well. And here we see again, for the majority of the institutions in all regions of the world, we do see that there is stability. That's it for, it varies a bit in terms of the numbers from one region to another, but it's the majority of the institutions in all regions expressing stable student enrollments for domestic students. However, when we look at the changes, increase versus decrease, we do see that in Europe, we have up to 36% of the institution reporting an increase in domestic students, whereas in Africa, on the other hand, we see 36% of the institutions reporting a decrease in student enrollment. So that's also an important aspect to keep in mind. In terms of international students, I'm only going to give you the global data because it's very pronounced, as most of the institutions are reporting a decrease in international student enrollment, up to 75% for exchange students, and then a little less for degree-seeking students, where it's between 56 to 62, depending on whether it's within the same region or from other world regions. So that's some of the trends that we have seen 1 year into the pandemic in terms of student enrollment. And then the last piece before you will be given the floor to react that I brought in is this. We have several questions in the report as well on human resources and impact on recruitment, etc. But I wanted to bring out this one, which was very pertinent again for all regions of the world, as they are reporting an important increase in the workload of staff. This one is on academic staff, but we monitored both academic and administrative staff, and the results were quite similar. So that is also something that we believe is important to monitor in terms of, is this temporary related to the shift in operations during the pandemic, or is this a new trend, and what does it mean for staff moving forward? So Hilligje, with that set of information, I will give you the floor again to take us around this first conversation.
Thank you very much, Trine, for this appetizer, I would say, because there is so much more that you can find in the document when you download it. I would like to indeed invite the different speakers to actually reflect on these different points. So on the funding, on the tuition fees, on the student enrollment, and this workload. But we will see how you reflect on it from your different perspectives. I will give the floor first to Maria Claudia Soler. So the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for the invitation to participate in this interesting panel. Since we're covering governance, I thought that one good way to start was to cover the results of our series of pulse point surveys on COVID-19, especially the point on top of mind issues. So we've been doing a series of surveys since the pandemic started, and we have done 12 surveys in the last 2 years looking at various issues. But one of the questions that we include in every survey is that we asked to select presidents 5 issues from a list of about 18 to 20 that they consider to be the most pressing. I share these results because they combine a bit of what we have talked about: governance and enrollment, and the various issues that Trine was just presenting earlier. So one of the things that we observed in the case of the US is that the immediate concern among university presidents when COVID started was the impact on enrollment numbers. So we were asking presidents, what is your immediate concern at the moment? And presidents were reporting that COVID was going to impact enrollment numbers for summer and for fall. Enrollment was really a top issue during the first half of 2020. And interestingly, while that was the case during the first half of the year, then at the end of 2020, mental health became one of the most important issues in the minds of presidents. So enrollment was really at the beginning, and then we shifted to mental health. Going back to the results that you shared about finance, for instance, one of the things that college presidents reported was that they were particularly concerned about the impact of the pandemic on long-term stability of their institutions. So different from what occurs in the results that Trine reported earlier, there is a large number of institutions in the US that are publicly funded. So while Trine reports that public funding was more or less stable in Europe, for instance, where the structure of higher education is different, in the US, public two-year institutions, what we call community colleges, were particularly concerned about what's going to happen with state appropriations, for instance, which is one of the most important sources of revenue for our institutions. So that was a main highlight. We had done another types of surveys looking at how revenues were changing and shifting, but I think it's good. I thought it was good for me to share what's in the minds, what was and what is still in the minds of our presidents regarding various issues. Other issues that came across from the governance perspective about what was concerning sustaining an online learning environment, short-term financial viability, racial equity issues, faculty and staff morale, which I know we're going to talk about that later, and retaining faculty and staff. So those were other issues. Regarding enrollment, for instance, while TRIN reports, for instance, that student enrollment had increases, same levels and decreases, we observed different things in the US. Right when the pandemic started, institutions reported decreases in enrollment across the board. They were particularly concerned, as I said earlier, about how higher education was going to, how the pandemic was going to impact their enrollment. But there were two particular findings that stood out. One is that 55% of all institutions reported an enrollment decrease. We also looked at in-state enrollment and out-of-state enrollment. But for the purposes of this presentation, we also looked at international student enrollment, and 64% of all the institutions reported an enrollment decrease. So again, it really shows a bit of these shifts and mixed findings depending on where in the pandemic we are asking the question. Which is why in 2021, we asked again about what was going on with enrollment and whether institutions were thinking that the COVID-19 pandemic was going to shift enrollment, student demographics moving forward. And 77% of the presidents told us, yes, we actually think that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to shift demographics. So it was not just a question about enrollment will decrease or decrease. It's also thinking about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who enrolls in higher education. So those are my 2 cents for the governance perspective and looking at the impact of COVID for US colleges and universities.
Thank you very much. Dr. Salama, the situation may be totally different or similar from your perspective.
Well, of course, yes. We're in Arab region here, although we have about 100 million students out of 2 billion all over the world. Yes, well, of course, the thing is different. And as you have mentioned, we in the Association of Arab Universities have half an hour, our members are from Africa, and the second half is from Asia. So we are not one region. So we have combined 2 regions. Of course, 2 sets of priorities were emerging for universities leaders. Operational challenges, such as managing risk and controlling costs, and the people aspects of running a university, encompassing everything from staff and student well-being to learning outcomes and research. The COVID-19 pandemic has presented the most serious challenge to academic governance in our area. The results of the Association of Arab Universities survey, and we did a survey between our members, indicated that the public funding have dropped down to nearly 43% of the respondent universities. In addition, about 36% of the Arab education institutions claimed a reduction of income generated from student fees, reduction of income generated from auxiliary revenues, and increase in spending to enrich the institution environment, including upscaling technology to facilitate proper teaching as an urgent consequences to COVID-19 pandemic. Even though COVID-19 resulted in the termination of the staff, including educators and administrative contracts, especially in the private sector, and this was very clear in the private sector, 70.2% of the Arab education institutions claimed no effect. Only 19.1% respondents admitted a reduction. Students of the Arab institutions were forced actually to migrate from face-to-face to online learning as students all over the world, and this promote change exposed incapacity among many students, especially those who lack skills in technology. And the most serious point is the ability to access technology due to financial issues. The enrollment of domestic students in the Arab education institutions was not affected significantly, actually. The enrollment of international students, whether from the same region or worldwide, dropped compared to prior academic years. 48% of the respondents declared decrease of the international students. The university in the Arab world depended on revenues from governments, and mainly, of course, most of our state universities depend on the governments and international and national tuition fees. They currently and in the foreseeable future are likely facing financial problems and now in the process of assessing their financials to only keep essential expenditures or enacting serious cost-cutting and saving measures. Universities may reduce many of faculty and staff or at least reduce their salaries and benefits. Well, this was a brief about the survey which we have done concerning governance in the Arab region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salama. This is actually quite worrisome if we hear what you have to say, because as we know, higher education is key to building a better future together. And we also know that there are more and more students coming to our sector, and that there is more funding needed, in particular also from the public sector. And we hope that governments will revisit their way of thinking about their higher education system and will fund it even better in the future, because we need a very well educated, strongly competent and skilled citizens for the future. And so we hope that what you now see can be addressed by governments and for them to then also act on it. Michael Gaebel, I'm very pleased to give you the floor and to lead us through the impacts in Europe.
Yeah, thanks, Hilligje. And for me, this is good afternoon, everybody. I mean, from our side, you saw the stats, it looks actually for Europe, that looks quite good in comparison. And this is because it's predominantly our higher education institutions are publicly funded. And when we looked at the immediate challenges that institutions reported, then it was about, that what we probably all have seen: higher costs for sanitary measures, unplanned investments in IT systems, delay and cancellations of projects, constructions, and then also some loss of incomes, for example, for services, contractual research, and then also in international tuition fees. So I think we have also seen a break-in of international student participation to some extent. Less so for domestic tuition and also domestic student participation. As you can see, there is there's also some increase. So we know that already from the 2008 crisis. In some systems, it's actually an opportunity because you lose your job. It's actually a possibility to go back to higher education and go back to learning. So a word about staff workload. We haven't really assessed that. It's more anecdotal, but we have seen that this was challenging. Everybody worked more than she would usually do. And I think it was also the new online blended situation that caused that, where it was really difficult to plan and to schedule your work. And to some extent, our suspicion is, while we are going back to campus now, that this is continuing with this parallelity of on-campus teaching, but then also some blended and to some extent some hybrid as well. Coming back to the financial side, I mean, overall, the crisis coincided, of course, also with the new financial budget of the European Union. And unlike in 2018, here the Union was united in that it needs investments rather than austerity and cuts. So that was actually good. Also good for higher education and research. It could have been better, we all think, but we shouldn't complain here. There was more money put in, and we conducted another study in 2020, which showed that out of 29 mainly European Union systems, in 22 systems, additional money was put into higher education. So that's good for the moment. We don't know yet how that looks in medium to long term. Institutions have increased financial needs now in view also of the transformation. So the digital approaches have been created in emergency. They need to be enhanced, perpetuated, improved. And at the same time, we see ourselves also under a growing shift towards greener, more inclusive approaches and an end. So there is a need for money to get these transformations done. And then I think what is worrying for all of us at the moment, about the war in Ukraine. So on top of what COVID costs, we can see now that budget priorities are shifting elsewhere. And I think we have to talk about this again in a year's time to see where we stand then. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I think you touched again on many important points also for others on also the workload. We've been surveying the workload on academics and on the administrative staff, and we all have also welcomed a perspective from students on the workload on the student side, of course, as well, with the consequences that has also on the capacity of people to continue in the same pace and at the same level. What I liked also what you said is everything needs to be enhanced, perpetuated, and improved, and that needs a serious investment, and that in Europe, decisions have been taken to increase the budget is an extraordinary good news. And as you said, there could have been more, but at least it was increased. We made that case on several occasions, you in particular at the EUA. But it's an example for other parts of the world where also this idea that you need to invest in order to harvest better is very important. On Ukraine, it is definitely a huge impact in Europe, but we see that similar situations have already impacted other higher education systems significantly. And Dr. Salama and Oyewole can say a bit about that as well, where in particular the war in Syria has brought about a lot of people displaced, integration in education systems elsewhere, etc. So it would be very good also to exchange on that and learn from other experiences.
I think a point is here also that there will be more investment in defense, of course, and this is what you start hearing, that we have to be careful with budgets now. So
no, you're right. You're right. That's a very, very important point, where actually we will. You can only spend $1 or €1 or whichever currency once and not twice. And if it goes to one end of the economic line, it will not go to the other. So let's hope that we will win and have more investment in education and not in war. But that's an important point you make. Thank you for that one. Philip Vaugther, let me turn to you, and then the perspective as seen from the Asian perspective.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you. So in terms of the Asia-Pacific region, which looks at most of East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific community, including Australia and New Zealand. In terms of finance, things were relatively stable. Again, the key term being relative, keeping in mind that there's huge variability both within the region as well as within individual countries within the region. I think one of the key findings in terms of governance is the thing that's really in flux in Asia and the Pacific right now is internationalization strategies. This has been a key cornerstone for recruitment and governance in a lot of institutions in the region. And I think we're seeing the university sector having to really critically reevaluate that, not only with borders being closed, but also willingness of students to relocate and to participate in international programs. So towards the end of 2021, a paper came out that said over 80% of prospective international students from China are not considering international education. And so that's going to have a huge impact, not only in the recruitment and governance of universities within the Asia Pacific region, but also further afield in other regions that was really looking at Chinese and other Asian students for recruitment numbers, especially for master's and PhD programs. I think another interesting finding from Asia is that we saw the least increase in workload for academics, staff, and admin staff. Again, everything is relative though. There was still a 51% increase reported. It's just compared to other regions, it didn't seem to be quite as high. We also saw a lot of reports from students that they felt relatively satisfied with how instructors transitioned to online teaching. So we might have a little bit more preparedness within the region for a transition to either a hybrid or an online session. Though I think it's important to remember that lockdowns in a lot of Asia didn't last quite as long as in Europe. So they returned to hybrid modes a little more quickly. And that probably had a really important influence on how students were satisfied with the curriculum they were receiving. But yeah, I think internationalization and the mobility of students, but also scholars, is really going to be one of the key things that was going to be reevaluated, both for Asian and Pacific universities being a destination, but also being a recruitment ground for a lot of other regions' higher education programs, especially those in master's and PhD level, where now we see students in Asia are a lot more reluctant to study abroad. They feel there's a lot of uncertainty. They don't want to be stuck in a limbo. They don't want to be stranded away from their home for up to 2 years and the risk of not being able to return to their lab or to their classrooms. And I think that's something the higher education sector, both within the region as well as globally, is going to really need to reckon with. International students dealt with a lot of uncertainty over the past 2 years. And for many, it's just a bridge too far. And how are we going to regain the trust of those international students that have been a cornerstone in a lot of our governance structuring as well as recruitment for the higher ed community is going to be really a point of considerable importance over the coming years. I think it's possible, but I also do think that with the tremendous amount of stability and borders reopening and then snapping shut again, it really has put into question a lot of trust that students and faculty have in something that was considered a given, like internationalization was considered to just going ongoing. This is where revenues was going to increase. This is where interdisciplinary studies were going to be getting a lot of talent. And that's really in question now. So even beyond the issue of online education and access, I think that from the region has been one of the points that we really need to consider is where do we go from here once the pandemic is in a more manageable stage? How do we rebuild these international partnerships as well as recruitment strategies that a lot of higher education sectors were really dependent on? Like Australia has been very dependent on international learners for some time, especially for its master's and PhD programs. All of that is a bit of uncertainty at the moment. And I think in terms of research and teaching, I might have a little bit more to say further on. But I also think a key component is remembering that there's a great deal of variability both within the region, but also within countries in the region.
Yeah, I think you raise a very important point here, that this heavy impact on these partnerships and internationalization at large, and what will the future be there. So that will be very interesting to look into. We're in the preparation of the 6th global survey on internationalization at the AArU, and we will invite you all on board of that exercise to really analyze the ins and outs and the future of internationalization as well. We had another webinar just this week with Trine Jensen, who launched the latest issue of AArU Horizons, focusing on reimagining higher education. And the speaker from Japan, from Tokai University, the Vice Chancellor of Tokai University, reminded us that indeed, due to the pandemic and everything that became uncertain, as you say, and reconsidered, leads in Japan, as an example, to a greater isolationism, and he was warning against that. So it's also very important to see how these impacts will translate in the future when it comes to our global picture of how we work together. So that's an important point. Thank you. I will now give the floor for 3 minutes to Roberto Escalante, UDUAL, to also shed some lights on perspectives from Latin America. Very early for you in the morning.
Well, then we say that in the early hours of the morning we work better. We are fresher. Well, thank you very much. For the invitation. I would like to devote, these 3 minutes that I have to comment on more on the qualitative aspects of the data. That I think might be interesting to look at. Well, I think in general around the world, if I could say something, COVID pandemic shaked the tree, if I could say so. It really made visible, all problems, very difficult problems that we had, particularly in the developing world, where there are structural differences, that really determine, how education, in this case, higher education, works. For instance, let me tell you that those who deserted university, that were, as Trin mentioned, 42%, which is a really high percentage. What we have to say is that those who abandoned university education were the poorest people, poorest students. Those who were coming from less income, families, people who didn't have the capacity to buy a tablet or a smart telephone or something, which could have given them access, to classes, to lectures. That's something that is important. Women is another another part, another actor that was had to abandon university education, and so that's something that I think we have to say. And it's interesting that those, the increase of those students, of the number of students who enrolled in higher education, were coming also from families that had good income. Let me tell you that, for instance, in Mexico, we discovered that rich families paid the lecturers to go to houses to teach students. That's something incredible. But they have the capacity to do that. So, what I want to say is that we have to look at all these numbers according to other variables that are there. Finance. Let me tell you something. Well, the higher education university universe in Latin America is extremely heterogeneous. But let me just speak, because I have only a few minutes, to talk about the public universities. 1 minute. Let me just tell you, the Brazilian universities were reduced by the President Bolsonaro more than 50% of money, for financing university, particularly the federal universities. In Mexico, yes, the finance remains stable, but in condition of pandemic, You don't need stable budgets. You need increased budgets, to do other things. So that's what we have to take into account. What the numbers are telling us in terms of the context in which universities and higher education is issued, to students and to other people. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much for this important point. Indeed, you have data, you have numbers, but then how do we let them speak? And that's why we're so very pleased to welcome you to this session here today. As well, maybe Trina, in presenting the next two sections for today, you may also explain at the end a little bit what we are also envisaging in terms of follow-up to this second global survey when it comes to more in-depth qualitative analysis of the data that we collected. So maybe that's a point that you could take on board. So I first give the floor to Olusola Bandele Oyewole, and thank you for leading us into the translation of this global perspective for Africa.
Yeah, I want to thank you very much. The first thing I want to say is that largely I want to agree with the report of Trine, which we greatly appreciate. The outlook in Africa is almost similar to what has been presented for the Arab region. In Africa, the pandemic caused a reduction in the level of incomes of higher education institutions. This because for so many months, schools were closed completely. And during this period of closure, income was almost stopped or less stable because of the students who stayed at home. I need to mention that many of the private institutions, private higher education institutions, were more affected than the public higher institutions. Indeed, it is speculated that as a result of the pandemic, government support to higher education decreased due to increased interest in health issues. It has also been found that the pandemic caused some relative decrease in student enrollment in Africa. Mobility of students from one country to the other, or international mobility, was greatly affected. Indeed, this decreased as a result of the pandemic. One area that the report had not looked into is the effect of the pandemic on gender enrollment in institutions. It is speculated that not many girls return back to their institutions after the pandemic. Largely, I will also report that the workload of staff in higher education institutions increased as a result of the pandemic, because in Africa, the pandemic resulted in the students and the staff needing to learn how to get digitalized for some academic jobs. So for some institutions, academic jobs were lost. Indeed, the pandemic made many private institutions to terminate the appointment of many academic staff. I will want to conclude my brief contribution to say that there are still some positive effects of the pandemic on higher education institutions. Because of the pandemic, many of the governance processes, including admission, applications, registration of students, examination, are now digitalized. I think that this is a positive effect of the pandemic, which will remain with us beyond the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you for ending on a positive note, because the rest was not that positive in the end, in particular when you think the decrease of funding. You may wish, after the presentation by Trine, also go back to what you just said, that there was a decreased interest overall in higher education. Is that from the government? Is that from the population? Is that from the people who were already involved? It's quite worrisome as well to hear that some positions in universities were just terminated. So you lose the qualified professors either to other jobs or to no position at all. And the system itself then is also suffering. So it will be good to hear a bit more about that, especially when it comes to teaching and learning and research. But I first turn to Trine before giving the floor back to you. And you will present on teaching and learning and on research, and you will be able to react to both in the next round of comments on this. Trine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hilligje. And yes, indeed, I will group the two last parts together and then we'll have another round because it's an interesting conversation, but time is running fast. I'm happy that I condensed this presentation on teaching and learning into just one slide, trying to just pull out a few of the things that we saw in the report. First of all, what we saw is that compared to the first global survey report that we did really at the outset of the pandemic, we have seen a huge increase in the number of institutions that were able to move to remote teaching and learning. And you'll see here on the screen that it was 89%. We also see that there is progress in terms of student access, but again, we see quite important inequalities among the regions. So if we see at the overall global average of outreach to students, we are at 86%, which seems very high. But when we then look a bit deeper into the details of the data, we see that while 39% of the institutions in Europe are reaching out to 100% of their students, it only concerns 40% of the institutions in Africa. And in the other, if we look at it the other way around, only 2% of the institutions in Europe reach out to less than 50% of their students, where this almost concerns 1 out of 4 in Africa. So there are quite an important progress compared to the first report that we did, but there are still very important inequalities. And I think this is still something that we need to debate. So even though we have seen an increase in access, what will the future bring if we become more reliant on digital tools? It is really important that it is made available to all. Something that we saw as another aspect was that in general, institutions are reporting an increase in the use of digital tools. I think it was by force, it was accelerated, of course, by the restrictions in place due to the pandemic. So for example, the use of online learning, digital communication with students. Professor Oyewole was also referring to the fact now they are transitioning to digitalized processes, whereas in other regions, maybe this was already digitalized before the pandemic. So the starting point was very different from one place to another, yet no matter where in the world, we have seen an increase in the use of digital tools. So the question is now, what does it mean for the future of higher education? Another thing that we found important in this second edition of the survey was to have a look at the different disciplines. And what we saw here was that, of course, some disciplines lend themselves better to remote teaching and learning than others. For example, what we saw was humanities, business and administrations. Such disciplines in institutions were indicating that there was not a great impact on the curriculum while teaching remotely. On the contrary, other disciplines requiring, for example, access to laboratory, more experimental work, health, agriculture, physical sciences, and engineering, there the impact on curriculum was more important. So we also have to take that into consideration, that it depends depending on the different disciplines taught. For those institutions reporting an important impact on curriculum, and that concerned 43% of the respondents, the different issues that they highlighted when responding to what type of impact was, first of all, 51% saying that there is a more theoretical rather than practical focus because of the restrictions due to COVID. 39% was saying our curricula became more practical in the sense of using case studies, problem-based learning in an effort to engage students from distance. And then 37% are saying that curricula is maybe become more flexible. Students have more freedom in choosing their learning path. And while the two first one may seem a bit contradictory, we see them in relation to the different disciplines, that those that lend themselves more easily to remote teaching and learning have become maybe more practical, using more case studies, whereas those disciplines where you rely more on laboratory, practical experience, etc., in those cases, the curriculum has become more theoretical. So the impact also depends very much of the discipline taught. The last one, I included that one on our curricula is becoming more flexible. Students have more freedom to choose, because I think that is an interesting outcome as well, because if that has been the case during the pandemic, what does it mean for the future? Does it mean that we'll change, or is this a temporary outcome? So some of the things that are important to follow up. This is what I brought for you on teaching and learning, but let me just do the part on research very briefly as well before our next tour de table. So on research priorities, we were trying to see if the pandemic after 1 year already had an impact in terms of research priority, but our data actually confirmed that the research priorities remain rather stable throughout the pandemic. The only exception is that we do see quite an important increase in the area of health and welfare, which makes sense in the context of a global pandemic. However, we also note that the situation is a bit different in Africa compared to the other regions, where it's more diverse. We have different groups, some reporting stability, some reporting increase, and some reporting decrease in priority. So more diverse situation in Africa than the other regions. What we see else in the global data is that we see many institutions, or 66%, reporting delays in research activities, and more importantly in the Americas and Africa, where this is 77%. And the main reasons that we saw coming out of this question is that it is due to travel restrictions, making it possible to attend conferences, also making it possible to, for example, undertake field work, that more time was required to ensure the teaching and learning part of the work, so to the detriment of research potentially, and also the fact that there is lack of access of laboratory and specialized equipment. So that's again a negative impact of the pandemic. But on the other side, we did also see almost a third of the institution reporting an increase in publications, but also increase in interdisciplinary collaboration. So I think that's interesting to highlight as well, and curious to hear if this is something that you have been observing as well. We also looked at trends in terms of research funding, whether they're going up, stable, or going down. And here, again, it's of course reassuring to see that for the majority of the institution, it's stable. But again, you see diversity among the different regions, where in Europe, we have 70% reporting stability and even 14% reporting an increase. Well, in Africa, the situation is rather different, where we have 45% of the institutions reporting stability, yet 40% of the institution reporting a decrease in funding. So it's not 40% decrease in funding, but it's 40% of the institution reporting a decrease. So this is still a very important thing to monitor, as we need to build research capacity in Africa. So for that, we need, of course, research funding. Final slide, and then we will take the next tour of the table, is on a positive note. I wanted to highlight as well that for international research collaboration, we actually saw that particularly in Africa and in the Americas, more institutions were reporting an increase in international research collaboration, and that they actually also find that the quality of this collaboration is increasing. So we are wondering whether the fact that we are turning more towards online collaboration, whether it opens up for new types of opportunities, particularly in Africa and the Americas, to engage differently, where maybe prior to the pandemic, there is the barriers in terms of financing, in terms of traveling, obtaining visa. Maybe this is some of the positive outlook that we see as well. So with that, Hilligje, I give you back the floor.
Thank you very much. Do you want to say just a little bit about where we go next with this?
Of course.
Yes.
As you mentioned it, I forgot, thanks for reminding me. This is of course a quantitative study where we used 75 questions, that I said, and we already had a hard time bringing it down to 75 questions, and it's a huge amount of data for the universities to provide. So we are of course very grateful for all the universities that are taking time to provide this data. What we've decided to do is different follow-up projects. We have been working with African partners where we're comparing data there as well in order to see some of the reasons why we see that trend in Africa. But we also have another AArU follow-up project, which is more a qualitative project where we're looking into a set of 10 questions, 5 focusing on internationalization and 5 questions focusing on teaching and learning, where we try to dig deeper and understand more specifically what is happening and why do we see these different results, and what do institutions think, how are we going to move forward for there. So hopefully we will be able to present on that later in the year or beginning of next year.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's important. It's also to respond to some of the questions that, or the points that were raised by the different colleagues. So I will not react this time because I see that time is ticking. So thank you very much for this global presentation. I will give the floor in the same order as we did earlier to reflect on these 2 very important points, teaching and learning and research, as you see fit. And then since this is also a session that will be displayed during the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference, you may have one point you would like to bring to the attention of the audience as a recommendation into the future, considering these three parts. All of that in less than 4 minutes, please, so that we can go around the table. So I go to you first, Maria Claudia.
Thank you so much. Regarding the US perspective, I think at the very beginning of the pandemic, what occurred is really consistent with the reports with the results that Trin shared earlier. The majority of institutions shifted to online remote teaching and learning, and that was really due to the fact that the pandemic had just hit, and college and university presidents were trying to figure out how to run and give continuation to their campus operations without disrupting teaching and learning that much. So the mechanism to do that was really online education, and that was really true across the board, regardless of institution type and sector in the US. Later in the year, we asked, later in 2020, we asked college presidents if that had changed, and that was still the case. Presidents were still doing things online. But by the end of fall 2020, we asked presidents the same question. How are you doing? How are you running your campus? Are you doing online teaching? How are you doing in-person teaching? Are you following a hybrid model? And 55% of the presidents described their institution offering predominantly online with some in-person instruction. So we shifted a bit from the fully online to the majority doing online, predominantly online with some in-person instruction. We then asked again the same question later, and the percentage rose to 59% of institutions that were offering predominantly online instruction with some in-person instruction. Then in fall 2021, so this is 1 year after, we asked institutions presidents how the COVID-19 pandemic had impacted their mode of instruction for 2021. What we heard from our presidents was that 50% of the institutions were offering primarily in person, but having more online instruction than before the pandemic. 18% said that the impact of the pandemic had occurred in a different way, and 31% told us that COVID this year, in 2021, hadn't really impacted instruction in fall 2021. So what we see here is a trend of, again, shifting from online to doing more online with some in-person to then doing more in-person with some online. And the projection might tell us that this combination of the hybrid model might continue in the years to come. It's hard to tell for sure if that's the case, but really this is a way in which we're observing institutions being much more creative in the offer of some courses. I think the observation that Trin shared with us about how some courses at the very beginning were more theoretical, and then some courses that had the applied component struggled a bit more. So that's where we saw a bit more of the in-person component in programs around nursing and some applied programs in two-year institutions in our community colleges for the most part. Programs at the four-year level, like in colleges and universities that offer a bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees. That's where we saw doing more in person for applied degrees, like students who needed to go to a lab to run their experiments and things like that. Things that were particularly relevant at the very beginning of the pandemic, and this is connected to some of the things that Roberto shared with us earlier, were challenges and disparities among who has access to high quality and affordable broadband internet, personal computers, and other technology. The transition to online learning was particularly challenging for instructors, students, institutions. It was a huge change qualitatively. And there were also financial hardships around including housing and food insecurity. So for students to pay attention to what was going on in class while their families were losing their jobs, that was also something that was really present at the very beginning. And it was occurring at the same time that instruction was transitioned to online across the board. What we observed that institutions were doing to minimize that impact, they were increasing the number of laptops, tablets, and mobile hotspots available to students. They were boosting their campus Wi-Fi students so that some students were able to access it from their parking lots. And we also saw increases in emergency aid availability or working with donors to create new sources of funding.
Thank you. These are very important points, in particular, also the creativity aspect that you underline when it comes to transforming the way in which we teach, and it came with a lot of creativity and agility and also flexibility on the part of both the teaching part and the students receiving the education. I would like to now give the floor to Salama.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not going to be long, but let me say that first that maybe I mentioned that half of our members are in Africa and the rest are in Asia, but there are some other classification which I would like to mention here, is that we have three groups of countries. We have the Gulf rich countries, of course, and we have the countries with conflicts, and you all know about them, and then we have the developing stable Arab countries, which so that the environment here is different to a great extent. But if we are talking about here the teaching and the learning, let me say that the Association of Arab Universities survey indicate that Arab institutions closures due to COVID-19 drove them to adopt technology. Various tools such as Zoom, Skype, and other video conferencing platforms became the ultimate new classrooms. Academic staff utilized the Blackboard, the Microsoft Teams, and other applications to collaborate and to deliver their courses. The institutions had to invest in technical infrastructure to be able to shift from face-to-face to online. The Arab institution respondents, 55.3% of them indicated growth in their capacity to acquire technology from the private sector. And let me say as well that most of the Arab institutions, 76%, announced the adoption and usage of various learning management systems, LMS, admitted usage of open education resources. Communicating with students was performed through digital communication, infrastructure and arrangements available in their institutions, and initiated many online activities to train academic staff how to perform teaching online. COVID-19 has affected all internships and placement tests in many Arab countries. 17% of the Arab institutions respondents announced cancellation of all internships and placements, 21.3% declared cancellation of international internships and placements. If we are talking about the research, and so that I should be very brief here, let me say that the results of our survey indicate that the research at the Arab higher education was impacted negatively from the spread of epidemic and closure and lockdown. 63.8% of the Arab institutions respondents claimed delayed in research activities because staff had to spend more time in teaching activities. 51% indicated that. The overall number of publications, the publication in international journals, the open access publications, and the quality of research collaboration in general increased, whereas claiming of patents, interdisciplinary collaboration of research activities, funding of the Arab institutions on research activities decreased. Let me end by saying that in our area, Arab higher education is facing some poor scientific research. That's because of Arab countries spend less than 1% of the total national income on scientific research. And another important point here that is 3% only of this, less than 1%, are funded by private sector. This is a general remark which I wanted to mention, and I'll end here.
Yeah, thank you. So less than 1% to scientific research, something that you want to also say to the UNESCO World Conference that has to change probably in the future. Then I would like to give the floor to you, Michael Gaebel.
Yeah, thanks. I think I can just second to what Dr. Ahmad said about the situation in learning and teaching. But also to emphasize that the universities, where it came out of the blue, but universities were not entirely unprepared. So they came to realize actually the many things, digital instruments, technology, but also knowledge that was already available at the institutions. It was not necessarily mainstreamed and known to everybody, but I think that's important. We believe to see that institutions that had strategies and structures had a slight advantage due to that. We also haven't seen any negative impact that the situation had on autonomy. Maybe on the contrary, I think in some systems, institutions enjoyed considerably more freedom to take things forward. Probably also because government or ministries realized that they were not really in command and didn't manage the situation. So they had to rely basically on staff and students and self-governed institutions. And I think another point here is that you could see that institutions that had good communication structures and participatory approaches involving students and staff, that was clearly an advantage. Overall, I think the positive side, in a certain way, it demystified digitally enhanced education on both sides. So I think everybody understood that it is not the remedy for all the problems that you might have, also with regards to participation and better learning, but on the other hand, it's also not the end of academic education. What we ask ourselves now, and this is difficult to grasp at the moment, what's going there to stay? And in this regards, we would be interested in the study that Trine mentioned that you are doing on education. So we can see clearly blended learning is not uncontested. Online will also be there. There is more concern or more doubt about hybrid approaches. There has been a lot about curriculum redesign, changes in curricula, and also in assessment. But again, to be seen what's going to stay there. My feeling is at the moment it's not an immediate big paradigm change. It might be a gradual change that we see over the years, a bit faster in some areas than in others. Just a word about issues regarding access and inclusion. I think what Roberto and also Olusola said in the previous round, I think that's very important. And while it is difficult to get clear data about dropout or low performance, and we don't have any immediate indication on that. As you saw in the stats, we have even increased participation, but I think we will have to assess that in 1 or 2 years, and probably also look at what happened actually at secondary schools in this period of time and how that impacts a transition into higher education. What you can clearly see, students and staff, they were not all equal, and that became quite obvious in this crisis. If you were disadvantaged before, you were worse off then. But also we saw that generally students with low or no income, they were at a higher risk of marginalization and poverty, reliant on parents who might themselves be out of jobs. So I don't have to explain that this year further. So you could also see that for students and junior researchers who were on scholar or fellowships that could probably be postponed but not extended. And that's then also a problem. But what would you live then? And quite many systems provided and institutions also provided some support. Yeah, I think that's it. Probably one last word about research. I think it's not really worrisome at the moment. As I said, it coincided with the negotiations of the next round of the EU's multi-annual research budget. But we ask ourselves, while we see, well, basically looking at all the ambitions that are there, what institutions should do in the future, do they have the budgets that actually match that? So that's a big question. And I think this is what we have to do here. I think the perception of higher education and research in Europe during the crisis, that was actually kind of a positive one. So people realized why it is important to have independent research and education institutions, because they delivered the expertise and also came up with some very practical solutions. And I think people also understood that there is not one easy answer to all the problems. So in a way that helped fighting populism that we faced increasingly. I think we have to translate this now also to the other challenges that we have ahead, such as greening, circular economies, and to say, if you want to do that, you have to invest in higher education and research. And indeed, there is not only one answer. So that's it. And I completely agree. International collaboration. We were worried about this. It was on hold for a while. You know, people postponed it because they thought, oh, crisis will be over in a few months, and then we travel again. But I think we see more institutions also woke up to the opportunities that virtual and digital exchanges offer there.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so sorry that this conversation does not have more time flexibility. We have 3 minutes left for each of the speakers. I give the floor to Olusola, Bandele, or Oyewole, because you also have another meeting coming up. So the floor is yours.
I want to thank you for giving me this privilege, and to say that teaching and learning ceased within the first 6 to 12 months of the pandemic in many countries in Africa. And when teaching and learning resumed, it was more of remote teaching. But after some time, most institutions decided to adopt what is called the blended learning, whereby both physical face-to-face teaching and the virtual teaching were promoted. But unfortunately, practical laboratory exercises, as the report had indicated, were more or less difficult or reduced.
We have an issue with bandwidth, maybe?
In many institutions, it was virtual learning, but to say that there are some positive things that emerge in teaching and learning. One, we found out that distance learning in Africa, interest in distance learning increased as a result of the pandemic. Secondly, because of the pandemic, many institutions lack the infrastructures for virtual learning, and therefore they reach out to the diaspora academia. So the pandemic has caused more collaboration between the diaspora and the African institutions. And we also need to mention that research generally appears to have been reduced or affected due to reduced funding for research, but the pandemic has increased interest in Africa promoting its own research. So the pandemic is now increasing interest in indigenous knowledge and African-based research. One thing we also found in the pandemic, as a result of the pandemic, is that it has promoted increased collaboration in research. More attendance in virtual conferences happened as a result of the pandemic than it has ever been before. Thank you very much. I want to apologize that I have to leave now because of the other engagement, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to make this contribution. I'm very grateful.
Thank you very much. And we meet each other in Barcelona as well for the other session. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So this is very important also to see how some of the findings in your reports do match also the global vision. But the floor is yours, Philip, to also explain the impact on your side.
I'll try to be brief. So as my colleagues have mentioned, in similar fashion, research and teaching quality remained pretty consistent within Asia Pacific over the 2 years of the pandemic. Though importantly, Asia Pacific took a particular hit in international funding for universities that I think will impact research going forward, whether that bounces back or it remains a permanent absence in other countries' overseas aid budgets. I think that's going to be an important thing to look towards. I think the bigger crisis is the impression of the quality of both teaching and research that has happened over the 2 years. The graduates, especially that are emerging from higher education institutions, are faced with hiring committees that are a little skeptical of, well, really, did you get the same skills? Really, did you have the same experience in research? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. We really did see a huge increase in theoretical research and desktop research. And across all sectors of hiring, public, academic, and private, I do think we might be faced with a generation of scholars emerging that may face some additional obstacles in getting hired because they might not have had that practical experience that previous cohorts had. The other two big things I think I'll make as a take-home message is I think universities in the region are very concerned of are online learning modalities really inclusive? There's a big narrative, especially from a lot of technological firms, that yes, they are. I think we need to take a really close look at that, and so do a lot of other universities, especially within very rich developed countries. There are huge variation in access. And even the quality of digital infrastructure, even when you pay a big fee or you're supposed to have good digital infrastructure, the quality varies quite highly. The other thing I think I'll emphasize as a take-home message is this online learning and working modality for higher education sustainable, not only from a psychological or social or inclusive perspective, but looking at from a consumption perspective, is it really more sustainable for people to be staying home in their households all day, running hundreds of households' energy and water systems rather than sharing a campus or sharing a given building? I really think, and so do a lot of institutions in Asia and the Pacific, that the jury's still out on that. And I think it's important to counter these narratives, especially that come out of the North American universities early on in the pandemic, that, oh, COVID's going to fix sustainability. It's like, well, maybe, but maybe not. I think we need to be careful in making conclusions. There is also that prediction that there'd be a huge baby boom as a result of COVID, and the proof has been the exact opposite. So I really think in terms of sustainable development, we really need to take a close look at what online learning and online work means for a sustainable planet.
Fantastic points, very interesting. So worth a next webinar for sure. I liked also those points that you make on the quality and on the impression of the quality. And it also goes back to the other point that you made, Michael, where you highlighted that we will have to also understand what the impact of COVID-19 on school education will have had and how that will impact the quality of the higher education systems in the years to come. So also a fascinating point linked to those infrastructures, the diasporas, the ambitions, the funding, and what you said, Dr. Salama, as well as on the one hand, enhanced capacity to work together, but on the other also the difficulties and the challenges. So Roberto, what do you make of all this from your end?
Thank you very much. Well, I would say that the pandemic, in terms of teaching and learning, has established something before and after a situation like that. In terms of quality, I would say not only for higher education, but for the whole education process in Latin America and the Caribbean in general. Of course, there are differences. Is a disaster. In my view, is a disaster. And the reasons are clear. Teachers were not absolutely prepared, I mean, to teach, to do real virtual education. And students, I mean, there is a lot of disparity in the students. Those students, I mean, that did not have access, have poor access, I mean, to virtual, the so-called virtual education, learn something extremely light. The fact goes even to the point, in my view, that the teaching and learning has been stratified quite clearly. Rich universities, I mean, do have all the equipment, all the preparation, all the human capital to do high quality education. And many other universities, particularly, and in this case, many public universities have, I mean, have very low quality education, I mean, for their students. And in terms of research, I mean, it sounds good that publications increased. The question is what for? I mean, in Latin America, only Cuba, even in the isolation, it has produced 3 vaccines. No other country in Latin America and the Caribbean produced 1 single vaccine. We had to depend on the transnationals. So, okay, I mean, we increase publications across the world. What for? Who benefits of that increase in terms of exchange of knowledge across the world? That's the question. And I think we don't have clear answers yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought. Thank you very much, Trine, for the global perspectives on these 3 very important points. Thank you, each of you, from the perspectives in the different regions of the world on these very important topics. And you brought about new points for further reflection in the future webinars in the AArU and EUA and UNU and AArU and UDUAL and ACE webinar series and surveys. I'm sure that there will be many more for people to benefit from, to trigger further discussion and opportunities for exchange. And so this is really a conversation starter for further exchange at the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference and way into the future. We will have at the AArU, like at your organizations as well, but let me please also highlight the fact that the AArU will hold its 16th General Conference in October, where the idea and the topic of relevance and value of higher education to future society will be debated. And it will be the moment where these points also will come back to the table, and the different points you raised that are new and coming out now in this period where the pandemic is still there, but taking a new face. So I would like to thank you all for your invaluable contributions and for helping everyone think ahead of where we are going to go with all this. Important points made, and again, opportunities for further discussions into the future. So thank you very much, and wishing you all a very good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll see you in Barcelona, inshallah.
In Barcelona.
Nice to see you all. See you soon in Barcelona with some tapas.
Very good. Thank you.
Goodbye.